conversational apologetics is an amazing opportunity for us in one-to-one at the pub with our neighbors. If you're invited to do a podcast or kind of public debate, it's an incredible opportunity, but it's also an incredible challenge. I find it very challenging. I don't think I'm at my best in the kind of open format. And so I'm trying to learn the tricks of the trade too. So hence the title of my lecture, Apologetics in the Crucible. A crucible is very hot, it's full of fire, it's very, very intense. And we need to learn basic practices to help us in that kind of context. Basically, I'm saying we need to be prepared. And of course, you can't have a talk in apologetics, especially on the first day, and not bring up the famous verse. But it is interesting that Peter says, always be prepared. And what we're trying to equip you guys with through this week is preparation for this kind of open conversation where it can go crazy. So always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And I think it's pretty obvious in terms of context, background, that Peter's referencing just an ordinary conversation. This isn't a public debate. It's be prepared in ordinary conversation as you have to field a question. And this always means wherever we are, whoever we're with, we need to have some kind of preparedness so we do well. And then he goes on, we have to say this because, in a sense, this podcast thing we're setting up is going to be quite aggressive from our side. Okay? Am I setting it up for us to win here? Yeah, okay, great. I thought you might like this. But this is where we have to add in. And the best public apologists, and there's an emerging generation, Christy, you'd agree with that, in the UK, of young apologists who are doing great public work. And most of them, I say, take up this next part of the challenge. They do it with gentleness and respect. And those who do public apologetics without gentleness and respect, I have to say, I often find them difficult. This is so, so important. Keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior, they're coming back with all kinds of charges against you, may be ashamed of their slander. So this is really important as we think this through together. So let's think about conversational apologetics, how it works, especially in the crucible, and how we can be prepared. What's going on in a typical apologetic conversation? How do we engage them? Well, just a few introductory matters here. Conversational apologetics really requires us to pay close attention to the cultural landscape. You guys are advanced. You know there's a number of different branches and disciplines when it comes to apologetics. The one I champion the most is cultural apologetics. And I think it's still rather neglected. It's getting better. I think many who love apologetics, love the kind of analytic tradition, find the best answer, pow someone with it, and they'll fall to their knees. But it generally doesn't work. And I think as apologists, we have to be deeply aware of cultural trends. And we have to think biblically in terms of how we engage the cultural trends. So we need to be very, very aware of cultural landscape, because this is always in the back of the conversation. It takes place in this milieu. Now, I don't have to tell you guys but we should just put it out there so we're all on the same page. Over the past few decades in Europe, there's been a massive shift in terms of worldview. I would say there's been an explosion. Charles Taylor calls it the supernova effect, which means there's been a proliferation of lots of new worldviewish thinking that's come into Europe. And this is all within the context of our continent becoming radically secularized. And in the last few decades, this has just been accelerated at a rate which is rather bewildering. It's interesting, back in the mid-20th century, almost 75 years ago now, an American public intellectual called Walter Lippmann talked about the acids of modernity, almost predating Bauman, who talked about liquid modernity. Acid breaks things down, it dissolves, and it dissolves some of our institutional frameworks that have actually helped keep certain worldviews in place. but it's really dissolved the impact of Christianity. It's still there. I love Taylor's double framework. Europe is Christ forgetful, but we have to add then it's also Christ haunted. There still is the memory, and we can draw from that memory. But the influence really has dissolved. It's disintegrated to some degree. And I think there's lots of Christians who haven't faced up to this fact when they have their conversation with unbelievers. And that's why they're unprepared. They haven't seen where the asses of modernity have done their work. Now, our current cultural landscape means two things for our conversational apologetics. This is just basic ground rule stuff. The first is our dialogue with unbelievers in whatever format always function, or almost always function, as a missionary encounter. So because of the secularization process in Europe, what we do is missionary in terms of crossing cultural boundaries. So cross-cultural mission isn't something you do when you go to Brazil now. It's what we do with our neighbors. We're on a podcast with a non-Christian. It's what we do with all the people around us. We're crossing cultural boundaries. So we should see ourselves fundamentally as missionaries in the old sense of the word. A missionary was a cross-cultural worker to communicate the gospel. I'm in regular conversations in Cambridge, where I live, with academics who are skeptics. I love skeptics. Skeptics and doubters are the things that excite me. And the people I talk with who are skeptics are incredibly bright, but I find in almost all my conversations with them, we're starting from ground zero in terms of understanding the Bible, or basically anything about Christianity which is substantial. In fact, I'm calling now people under 30 the unreached. So we think of the unreached in missionary terms as outer Mongolia, the outbacks of Bulgaria. But actually, the unreached are all around us. Under 30 is amazing. So we've just recently in Cambridge set up a church for skeptics and doubters. I pastor this church. It's small, but it's so wonderful what the Lord is doing with skeptics. But we have people doing their PhDs at Cambridge who don't know that the Bible consists of an Old Testament and a New Testament. So that's the level of biblical illiteracy that we've moved into. We need to be aware of that in terms of the conversation. So we can't assume that people have a biblical worldview framework for matters like sin. That's one of my passions. How do we make sin plausible in this modern age? Grace. Wow. I mean, that's a word which is just about meaningless. Forgiveness. I could multiply the list. People just don't have a framework to even begin to in terms of understanding what this means from our side. So have it in mind, we're missionaries, and we need to be very aware of this. If we're not aware of the missionary endeavor, we're like pre-Reformation Catholic priests who did the Mass and everything else in the church in Latin. Nobody understands. We don't want to speak Latin. Conversational apologetics shouldn't happen in Latin. If you start speaking in Latin on Wednesday in the Relentless podcast, oh boy. And Latin is a kind of Christianese. It's just way too easy to use religious lingo that nobody understands. So we have to be very careful when it comes to that. I think what I'm saying here is what Keller called a truly post-Christendom evangelistic dynamic. That's what we have to commit to if we're going to do conversational apologetics well. A truly post-Christendom evangelistic dynamic. So, how do we be prepared? Well, become missionaries in the truest sense of what that means. Prepare ourselves for cross-cultural dialogue and encounter. The second way we need to be prepared is appreciating that many, not all, but many of our conversations with unbelievers start from a place of hostility from the other side towards Christianity, towards what we believe. So Christianity isn't only incomprehensible to secular people, it's also offensive. Now, we're seeing in the United Kingdom signs that this is slightly dissipating amongst some of our public intellectuals who aren't Christians. They seem a little bit more friendly, some of them. But generally, the people we talk to in Europe start from the place of hostility. So, as I say, not just incomprehensible, now positively offensive. And our conversations have to factor this in. The way I put it is 70 years ago, the West became indifferent to Christianity. Might be privately engaging for you, but publicly it's utterly irrelevant. But over the last 20 years, this indifference is turned to hostility. And many think Christianity isn't even fit for the private sphere. So I had a conversation with someone in Cambridge not too long ago. I attended a lecture by a famous academic, absolutely brilliant. Got chatting to the guy beside me. 15 minutes in, the lecture theater is pretty much empty, and I just disclosed that I'm a Christian. It had been such a wonderful conversation. His face changed color. He trembled, and he just said, I cannot believe that someone who seems so decent, someone like you, could actually believe that filth. He was so disgusted. And you could say that's extreme, but I'm not sure it is that extreme. I think many people on the street who we encounter see what we believe as utterly reprehensible, and we need to take that into account. Now, this hostility has different leading edges. You guys will know that sex and gender is a big one today. So we're on the wrong side of these issues which have such cachet in terms of the public discussion. I think many see Christians as colluding in the very worst sins in the history of the West. So it's white man's religion. It's the religion of the oppressor that has little time for the oppressed. So on so many of the hot-button issues of our day, we're cast as the villains. That's the starting point. That's the starting point we're going to start from on Wednesday. So racism, Christians colluded in that. Homophobia, yep. And some of them will drag up the evidence. Misogyny, Christian issue. Post-colonialism, which is a massive issue today. Well, look at all those missionaries who just colluded in the colonial enterprise. So the creed of many in Europe today is very simple. I call it A, B, C. Anything but Christianity. I like things simple. I'm a simple man. That's the creed of so many, anything but Christianity. Maybe this is changing, but I still think on the ground, this is where most are coming from. So we have to be prepared for this kind of environment. And it shouldn't push us to be highly defensive and aggressive and angry. We should just be aware that this is where most people start from when it comes to what we stand for and what we believe. I think it's also really good for us to know that this isn't a new thing in the history of the church. This post-Christendom reality, wow, the very fact that Christendom, we could discuss that for an hour. What does that mean? But Christendom, it just means the Christianization of a civilization. The civilization of Europe lasted for a very long time, but of course Christians have existed in contexts and arenas where it wasn't like this, where they were the beleaguered minority. So we're not in a new space today. And I always find it interesting when Christians look perplexed that we're not liked. Just think, well, there's lots of people in the southern hemisphere who aren't liked for what they believe in various places, and it's been true of the church for most of its history. So don't be surprised. That means don't get defensive about it. Right, so our encounters in terms of conversational apologetics, all missionary encounters, we have to cross cultural boundaries. That means awareness. And the background to the conversations often starting from a place of hostility. So let's think now for a moment before we get to open questions. What should the conversation look like in this crucible? The one I've just laid out for us. Well, I think we have to learn to function in two modes. We have to move from one to the other often quite quickly. So here I'm going to use a sporting analogy or metaphor. First, we have to engage in what I call defense mode. What should conversational apologetics look like in the Crucible? Two modes. First, the defense mode. Not the same as being defensive. It simply means that we have to overcome the attack, the charge of the other side. If they're starting from the place of hostility with the charges, we have to defend them. It's been a huge part of the apologetic enterprise right from the beginning of the church's history. But then we have to switch to the offense mode. We have to do both of these. We'll pick these up in a minute. So we have to learn how to turn the conversation around. You're going to get to this in the next one. To turn defense into offense. And can I just make the point here? I said defense isn't being defensive. Offense isn't being offensive. Many Christians are great at being offensive publicly. Peter says, don't do it. Gentleness and respect. So we have to learn how to turn it around. So let's think first about what the defensive mode will look like. I think because we're in the fire, the line of fire, we're not going to be able to avoid taking up defense mode. It's interesting, back in the early church, this is how most apologetic functioned. So as Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it was subjected to lots of charges. The best one I've encountered is that Christians are cannibals. I've been charged of many things with my skeptic friends. Thankfully, no one's ever called me a cannibal. But that's quite something. The Lord's Supper, the body of Jesus, partaking of it. Christians are cannibals. They have to defend against that kind of charge. And now this is exactly what you see going on with the great Justin Martyr, one of his best books, First Apology of Justin Martyr. Much of this is defending against charges that the early church was subjected to. I think the greatest apologetic defense in the history of the church is Augustine's The City of God. So Christians were blamed for the sack of Rome in 410, which was utterly earth-shattering to the empire, and from the Caesar to the elites, many in the Senate, this happened because Christians opposed the worship of Roman gods. It's the Christians' fault that this happened. And Augustine, first third, just demolishes the argument by going to its context and said, actually, the worship of your Roman god led to that. It wasn't our fault. So it's a devastating defense. So in our apologetic conversation, remember, it's open. You never know what's going to come next. We're going to frequently need to be in defense mode to answer the charges that are put against us. And that's, again, part of what Peter is saying in the famous verse. He's saying, give an answer back. Make your defense. Now, our defense today will need to be two-pronged. The first is we just have to own up to where the charges are valid. So sadly, the church does have a historical record of injustice. We have to own up to that. So the church did collude in slavery. There were theologians, notable theologians in the southern states of America who justified slavery in the mid-19th century. They justified it biblically. And yes, women have been oppressed by the church. There is a history of misogyny in the church, and it's a very tragic one, and sadly it's ongoing. And yes, gay and trans people have been terribly treated by certain Christians through the ages. And because of this record, part of the defense mode is just to hold up our hands and say, we got it wrong. And we apologize for that, a sincere apology. But as we hold up our hands and acknowledge and confess where we've gone wrong, we never compromise the truth of Scripture. So on the gay and trans issue, we own up to our failures where we mistreated them, but we also do that knowing we have a different moral framework for understanding how this works, a God-shaped one. So it's possible to own up for your sin and not compromise. So many Christians think owning up means accommodation. No. We went wrong, but still we remain faithful to what the Bible says. The second part, we could say so much more here, the second part of the defense mode is correcting false narratives. So the majority of the current hostility and criticism towards Christianity is terribly exaggerated. Can I say it again? Most of what you hear through the media about what Christianity is responsible for is terribly exaggerated. I think it's justified to call it a form of propaganda. So it's said that Christianity has a terrible history when it comes to slavery. Yes, we colluded, but here's pushing back on the false narrative. It was Christians who were at the forefront of the abolition movement. I heard a public intellectual say last week or the week before that the Enlightenment was responsible for the abolition of slavery. Nonsense. It was Christianity, Christians, who engaged in that issue. It's also said that Christianity is inherently misogynistic. We say, no. Look at Jesus. Look at Paul. They were the great founders of a movement for the liberation of women. We push back. We give a different narrative. This is what we frequently get in Cambridge. Christians are against science. They believe in flat earth, sadly. Many do. Oh, it's just so painful. I had a non-Christian 2 days ago, a skeptic, went on a walk, and she asked that. Why do so many American Christians believe in flat earth? I just wanted to cry. Wow, so sad. But of course, we push back. We say, actually, at the forefront of the modern scientific revolution were Christians, great Christians. Cambridge is wonderful. You do the walk and you say, let me tell you about Cavendish. And then you tell the story. There's many other great Christians who were scientists in Cambridge who we can talk about. Christianity is not against science. So these are the kind of things we need to prepare for in our conversational apologetics. Holding our hand up in defense mode. Yes, 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 but you're going too far. That's exaggerated, which means we need to know a little bit of history. We need to do some reading. Right, if that's the defense mode, let's think quickly about the offense mode. We should never only be on the back foot. I sometimes come away from a conversation thinking, I was just way too much in the back foot. Defense, defense, defense. But we need to learn how to move into the offense mode so we're not just defending goal, to come back to the sporting metaphor. What we need to do, this is old English football, is just punt the ball. This is the long ball approach. Just punt it into the offense and hope something positive emerges. No, we need to do a little better, but we have to move out so we're in the offensive side. We're not just defending. Now here I want to suggest the most effective way to quite quickly turn defense into offense. We need to employ the use of the question. We're going to hear much more about this in our next session. Let me just put it like this. It's hard to overstate the power of the question. I've done some work amongst the philosophers in the power of the question, and the more I look at the question, the more questions I get about the questions. It's great, isn't it? It's absolutely wonderful. It's just such a gift from the Lord. It's, at one level, when put correctly to the person, it's quite harmless, but it might be the most dangerous and disturbing force in the whole universe, a well-timed question. And one of the things I love about the Gospels, if you look at Jesus' interactions with people, he was the master of the question. I love the American English poet T.S. Eliot, who became a profound Christian. But one of his descriptions of Jesus was the stranger who asked questions. That's beautiful. The stranger who asked questions. So we're going to get much more on this in a moment. Let me look very briefly at what the question is capable of accomplishing. First, it exposes belief systems. So there's no better way to turn defense into offense by simply asking someone what they believe. It might be about the matter that's right before you in the conversation, but to use questions so you can unpack their worldview. So the question is like a sharp tool to go beneath the surface. Often conversations are quite surface, and you gently, with a question, press people to what they believe to excavate their worldview systems. Now, Michal is produced what he calls the worldview mapping tool. Ask him for a copy. I've given it to many. It's an interview. You can say a little bit more. It's just an interview process where you say, could I have half an hour of your time? And in this half an hour, I just have a whole bunch of questions I'd like to ask you. I'm not going to comment. I'm just going to ask you, and I'm going to take notes as I go along. Is there 11 questions? Yep. Quite simple. I've done it with some people who are not Christians, and most are quite open to it. The great thing is you don't do much talking. You just ask the question and listen to their answers and take notes. As you go through it, it's quite interesting to see people often wake up for the first time. Oh, I've never thought about that before. And suddenly it becomes a little bit clearer for them. This is what I believe about this matter for the first time. Because a lot of people aren't very conversant about their own worldview. And as you keep going through it, some people begin to see, oh, hang on, that's a contradiction. On this question up here, I said this in terms of what I believe is fundamental to reality. And here I've just said, am I a naturalist? Am I a materialist? It highlights the contradiction. So there's lots of ways we can use questions, but we really need to learn its art. The other thing, so you use the question in order on the offense to get a sense of what people believe, where their worldview is coming from. I think this is really important for me. And we think of apologetics as answering people's questions. I worked in L'Abri for 21 years with very bright people. Most people didn't know what their questions were. And many today don't have questions. But they have answers. So, yes, when someone asks us a basic question about the existence of God, we give the best answer we can. But I think the power of the question is to question the answers that the other side have. So yes, answer their questions, but question their answers. And I use this a lot in my teaching, just to flip that. It actually makes you think about apologetics quite differently. Because we think, just give them answers, give them answers, give them answers. No, question their answers. Because everyone has a worldview. So begin to question it. Now, we're going to get a little bit more into this in the next session, but let me give you a few examples. Take the matter of identity. So I think the modern framework for how the self functions, we are on the greatest identity quest in all of history. It's hard to look back in history and see people who are more obsessed with their identity than we are today. So we're all on the great identity quest, and we've never been more lost as to who we are. There's a delicious irony. But ask questions about people's identity. How do you find your identity? What do you use in order to be you? And the typical answer you're going to get back is, well, I just need to be true to myself. Now, if you're with a philosopher, this is great. I mean, you just use a bit of Aristotle, and you do some good work on that one. That's an amazing statement. I'm just completing a book, which is just trying to unpack what this statement means. Be true to yourself in terms of finding an identity. But you come back with another question. So do you think being true to yourself is secure enough in terms of who you are? Or is you think self-creation is possible? You can actually create yourself independently of anything beyond you. And if it's someone in sociology, you just say, you heard of George? You know George Mead. Yeah, he's the one who posited the idea rightly about the social self. No one self-creates without the impact of other social factors. This is just basic sociology. So there's so many problems with the idea of being true to yourself. That's what most people stand on in terms of an ideology, a thought world of how they become themselves. It's about self-creation. There's lots of ways we can begin to question that answer. The same is true on the matter of happiness. I think happiness has become a very public matter for people to engage, although I'm noticing there's just a shift now from happiness to meaning, which is really, really interesting, because I think meaning is actually more substantial than happiness. But ask people, what are you committed to in terms of the happy life? And they'll tell you, good love life, good sex life, money, health, fitness, and you can begin to question that answer. How substantial are those things? So there's lots of creative ways we can think about how we question the answers that people have on some of the big issues of our time. So the takeaway is what we're going to be listening for on Wednesday is question our answers. I'm the pretty aggressive atheist. He's just Mr. Airy-fairy spirituality of everything. Question our answers. This is what we have to learn to do. Now, I said at the beginning, huge opportunity, conversational apologetics. I guess here's where I'm coming from. I think 20 years ago, the church was a little bit renewed in the importance of apologetics. Many thought what we have to do is produce great debaters, like John Lennox. Whole movements. We've got to raise up lots of John Lennoxes. We need John Lennoxes, absolutely. But I think we missed a trick, just the power of ordinary conversational apologetics. And if we did much more of our focus there 20 years ago, I think we'd be better off than we are now, which is why we have to come back to it. Huge opportunity, because I think today people are more open to a conversation, even if they're hostile. They're just open to talk. I'm finding this with people on my street. I'm having better conversations now than I were 3 years ago. Huge opportunity, but huge challenge. Huge challenge. But here's where we need to remember we're not alone. So let me finish with these wonderful words of Jesus when he sent us out for the great mission, discipling the nations, some have called it. Listen to what he said. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And here's the word for all of us as we finish this. And surely I am with you always. I'm with you as you engage this to the very end of the age. We're not alone as we engage in the great debates of our time.